3 weeks after my mother passed away, I was still processing the grief when Karen Hendricks decided to make my life infinitely more complicated. As the self-appointed queen of Willowbrook Estates, HOA, Karen had spent the better part of 5 years turning our peaceful suburban neighborhood into her personal kingdom of petty tyranny. What I didn't expect was for her to set her sights on my family's property the moment my mother was laid to rest. I was quietly sorting through Mom's belongings on a Tuesday morning when I heard the distinctive sound of Karen's heels clicking up the front walkway. Through the window, I could see her clutching her ever-present clipboard and wearing that expression that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. I took a deep breath and opened the door before she could assault it with her knuckles. "Good morning, Karen. What can I help you with today?" I said, maintaining the polite tone that had served me well in my 20 years as a corporate mediator. Karen didn't bother with pleasantries. "I need to conduct an immediate inspection of this property," she announced, pushing past me without invitation. "There have been numerous violations reported, and as HOA president, I have the authority to ensure compliance with our community standards." I closed the door slowly, watching as Karen began photographing my mother's living room with her phone. "I'm sorry, but what violations are you referring to? My mother maintained this property meticulously for 30 years. The grass is clearly over the permitted height," Karen said, not looking up from her documentation. "The mailbox paint is chipped, there's a newspaper still in the driveway from yesterday, and don't get me started on those overgrown rose bushes. This is exactly the kind of negligence that brings down property values for the entire neighborhood." I found myself almost admiring the audacity. My mother had been gone for exactly 21 days, and Karen was already circling like a vulture. "Karen, I understand you have concerns, but this really isn't an appropriate time. I'm still handling my mother's affairs. Death doesn't excuse HOA violations," she replied with the warmth of a tax audit. "In fact, according to Section 12.7 of our covenant, properties that fall into disrepair due to owner absence or incapacity are subject to immediate remediation at the homeowner's expense." That's when I realized this wasn't just about grass height or chipped paint. Karen had been waiting for this opportunity, and she wasn't going to let a little thing like basic human decency stand in her way. I watched her march through my mother's home like she owned the place, taking photos and making notes with the efficiency of a seasoned inspector. "I'll need access to the backyard, the garage, and the basement," Karen continued, not bothering to ask permission. "There are reports of unauthorized storage and potential fire hazards. As HOA president, I'm legally obligated to investigate these matters thoroughly." I followed her through the house, fascinated by her complete lack of self-awareness. "Karen, who exactly reported these violations?" My mother was bedridden for the last 6 months. She couldn't have created any new issues. "That's confidential information," Karen said, though the slight flush in her cheeks told me everything I needed to know. She had been surveilling my mother's property, probably with binoculars from her kitchen window, just waiting for something to complain about. In the backyard, Karen began photographing my mother's prized vegetable garden. "These plants are clearly exceeding the height restrictions for rear yard landscaping. The tomato stakes are creating unsightly vertical elements that violate our aesthetic guidelines." I stared at her for a long moment. "Karen, those are my mother's tomatoes. She planted them every year for 3 decades. They're not violating anything. Sentiment doesn't override HOA regulations," she replied, making more notes. "These will need to be removed immediately, along with that unauthorized compost bin and the decorative bird bath that wasn't approved by the Architectural Review Committee." That's when I decided Karen needed a reality check. I excused myself and went inside to retrieve something from my mother's filing cabinet. When I returned, Karen was measuring the distance between fence posts with a tape measure she had apparently brought specifically for this purpose. "Here's something you might find interesting," I said, holding up a folder. "This is the original property deed for this house, dated 1994. Would you like to take a look?" Karen barely glanced at the document. "Property deeds don't supersede HOA authority. Every homeowner in Willowbrook Estates is bound by our covenant, conditions, and restrictions. No exceptions." "You're absolutely right about the covenant," I agreed. "But here's the interesting part. According to this deed, and the survey that was conducted when my parents purchased this property, the HOA boundaries don't actually extend to this lot." For the first time since she'd arrived, Karen stopped what she was doing. "That's impossible." Every property in this neighborhood is part of the HOA. It says so right in the welcome packet. I opened the folder and spread the documents on my mother's patio table. See, when Willowbrook Estates was developed, this lot was actually part of the original farmland that predated the subdivision. My parents bought it directly from the farmer in 1994, 2 years before the developer started building the rest of the neighborhood. Karen snatched the papers from the table, her eyes scanning the legal descriptions with growing alarm. This can't be right. You've been paying HOA dues for years. You've been following HOA rules. You're clearly part of this community. Actually, we've never paid HOA dues, I said. My mother received the bills, but if you check your records, you'll find she never actually paid them. She kept meaning to call and explain the situation, but she was always too polite to make waves. I could see the wheels turning in Karen's head as she processed this information. For 5 years, she had been including my mother's property in her mental kingdom, never realizing she had no actual authority here. The beautiful irony wasn't lost on me. Even if that's true, Karen said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence, there are still city ordinances about property maintenance. I can report violations to the municipal authorities. You're welcome to try, I replied. But since this property is zoned agricultural residential, most of the city ordinances you're thinking of don't apply either. The grass can be as tall as I want it. I can have as many garden vegetables as I can grow, and that compost bin you're so concerned about is actually encouraged under the county's environmental sustainability guidelines. Karen's face was beginning to turn an interesting shade of red. This is ridiculous. There has to be some authority that can force you to maintain basic community standards. Community standards are interesting things, I mused. For instance, there are standards about harassment, trespassing, and making false claims about legal authority. Those tend to be enforced quite seriously. That should have been the end of it. Any reasonable person would have apologized for the misunderstanding and gracefully retreated. But Karen Hendricks had never been accused of being reasonable, and she certainly wasn't about to start now. I don't care what your papers say, she declared, waving the deed dismissively. This property affects the entire neighborhood's aesthetic and property values. As HOA president, I have a responsibility to all the homeowners who elected me to maintain our community standards. Karen, you can't just ignore legal documents because they're inconvenient, I pointed out. This deed has been recorded with the county for over 30 years. It's not going to change because you don't like what it says. We'll see about that, she said, pulling out her phone. I'm calling my lawyer right now. There are ways to force non-conforming properties into compliance, and I intend to explore every single one of them. I watched her dial with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. Karen was actually going to pay legal fees to challenge a property deed that had been properly recorded and maintained for 3 decades. The sheer wasteful audacity of it was almost impressive. While Karen spoke in hushed tones to someone who was probably billing her $200 an hour to explain basic property law, I decided to do a little research of my own. I pulled up the county assessor's website on my phone and began looking into the history of HOA filings for our area. What I found was even better than I had hoped. Karen, I said after she finished her call, I have some news that might interest you. According to the county records, the Willowbrook Estates HOA was never properly incorporated as a legal entity. She looked at me like I had just claimed the moon was made of cheese. That's impossible. We have bylaws, we collect dues, we hold elections. Of course we're legally incorporated. Having bylaws and collecting money doesn't make you a legal corporation, I explained. You have to file specific paperwork with the state, maintain registered agents, follow corporate governance rules. None of that appears to have been done when your HOA was established. Karen's confident expression was beginning to crack. The developer set all that up when the neighborhood was built. It's all been handled properly. I showed her my phone screen. According to the state business registry, there's no record of Willowbrook Estates HOA as a legal entity. No articles of incorporation, no registered agent, no annual filings. Legally speaking, your HOA doesn't exist. The silence that followed was almost deafening. I could practically hear Karen's worldview crumbling as she processed the implications. For 5 years, she had been acting as president of an organization that had no legal standing to enforce anything. That can't be right, she stammered. We have contracts with the landscaping company. We maintain the common areas. We enforce deed restrictions. You have informal agreements to maintain some shared spaces. I corrected. But without proper legal incorporation, you have no authority to enforce anything. Every violation notice you've sent, every fine you've levied, every threat you've made has been legally meaningless. I could see Karen calculating how many neighbors she had bullied over the years with her imaginary authority. The number was probably quite high, and I suspected some of them were about to be very interested in learning about their HOA's legal status. This is just a paperwork issue, Karen said, though she sounded like she was trying to convince herself as much as me. We can file the incorporation documents retroactively. The state allows for that kind of correction. Actually, they don't, I said. Retroactive incorporation isn't a thing. You'd have to start over completely, which means every action your HOA has taken in the past 5 years would need to be ratified by a properly incorporated entity. Every fee, every fine, every enforcement action would be open to legal challenge. Karen sat down heavily in one of my mother's patio chairs, the weight of her situation finally sinking in. She had built her entire identity around being HOA president, and now she was discovering that her kingdom was built on a foundation of legal quicksand. "What do you want from me?" she asked quietly. "I want you to leave my property and never come back," I said. "I want you to stop harassing my neighbors with fake legal authority. And I want you to publicly acknowledge that your HOA has been operating without proper legal standing." "I can't do that," Karen said. "It would destroy everything we've built here. People would stop following the rules. Property values would plummet. The neighborhood would fall apart." "Maybe," I agreed. "Or maybe people would just start acting like decent neighbors without needing a fake authority figure threatening them with imaginary consequences." Karen stood up abruptly, her clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. "This isn't over. I'll find a way to make this right. There has to be some legal remedy." "Good luck with that," I said. "But I should mention that interfering with someone's property rights when you have no legal authority to do so can be considered harassment. Continued trespassing after being asked to leave can result in criminal charges. And making false claims about legal authority might constitute fraud." For a moment, I thought Karen might actually back down. Her face had gone pale, and she seemed to be reconsidering her options. But then her jaw set in that familiar stubborn line, and I knew she was about to make a very expensive mistake. "Fine," she said. "If you want to play legal games, we'll play legal games. I'm filing an injunction to prevent you from letting this property deteriorate further. I'm requesting a city inspection of every structure on this lot, and I'm organizing the neighborhood to petition for eminent domain if necessary." I had to admire her commitment to doubling down on a losing position. "Karen, you realize that filing frivolous legal actions can result in sanctions, don't you? Especially when you're acting without legal standing." "We'll see who's acting without legal standing," she snapped, marching toward the gate. "I've been protecting this neighborhood's property values for 5 years. I'm not going to let one stubborn homeowner ruin everything I've worked for." After Karen left, I spent the afternoon making some phone calls of my own. First to the county clerk's office to confirm everything I had discovered about the HOA's legal status. Then to a real estate attorney who specialized in property disputes. And finally to a few neighbors who I suspected might be interested in learning about Karen's lack of actual authority. The response was immediate and overwhelming. It turned out that Karen had been liberally abusing her imaginary power for years, and plenty of people had grievances they'd been afraid to voice. By evening, my phone was ringing constantly with neighbors wanting to know more about the HOA's legal problems. The next morning, Karen was back, but this time she brought reinforcements. She had somehow convinced 3 other HOA board members to accompany her on what she called a formal property assessment. They arrived with clipboards, cameras, and an attitude that suggested they thought strength in numbers would somehow make their lack of legal authority disappear. "We're here to conduct an official HOA inspection," announced board member Patricia Winters, reading from what appeared to be a prepared script. "This property has been reported as non-compliant with community standards, and we are authorized to document violations and assess penalties." I invited them all to come inside for a conversation. Once they were seated in my mother's living room, I laid out the same documents I had shown Karen the day before. I explained the property deed situation, the HOA's incorporation problems, and the legal implications of their continued harassment. The 3 board members looked increasingly uncomfortable as I spoke. Unlike Karen, They seemed to grasp the seriousness of operating an unincorporated entity while claiming legal authority they didn't possess. "Karen, you told us this was just a routine property inspection," said board member Michael Torres. "You didn't mention anything about disputed boundaries or incorporation issues." "Because they're not real issues," Karen insisted. "He's just trying